Victoria Calloway dismissed me without looking up from her presentation slide. She said, in the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it, that facilities concerns could be directed to the building coordinator after the session. I told her I was the building coordinator. She looked up then, took in a badge, the clipboard, the worn jacket I had been wearing since before Nadia started school. Then she looked back at her presentation and said, with the efficiency of someone who had already closed the subject, that she was sure I was very good at my job and that someone would follow up with me at the appropriate time. The room turned back to her. 31 people in good chairs at a polished table under lights I had calibrated that morning. Nobody held eye contact with me for longer than it took to decide I was not relevant to what they were doing. I sat back against the wall and held the clipboard in both hands and said nothing. But I've been reading the citation on that slide for the past 4 minutes. The one that put my name on a projected screen above 31 people who did not know it was my name. And I knew, with the certainty that comes from having written the work and then corrected it, that the room was preparing to approve a $400 million investment built on a calculation I had published in 2013 and formally revised in 2021. The revision changed everything. The room was using the wrong version. If you have ever watched someone with real power decide that you do not exist and felt the weight of what it costs to stay quiet about something that matters, stay with us until the very end. What happened in that meeting was not what any of them expected. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The alarm on my phone went off at 5:20 every morning. By 5:40, I had coffee started and Nadia's lunch packed. She ate slowly, which I had accepted as a fact of her character long before I stopped trying to change it. She read while she ate. She drew while she read. At 9 years old, she already had her mother's ability to hold 3 thoughts at the same time in her mother's handwriting, which had always been cleaner than mine. That morning she had asked me, while I zipped her backpack, whether my job was important. I told her every job mattered if you did it right. She considered this for about 4 seconds, then asked if she could have 2 fruit snacks instead of 1. I gave her 1.5. She called it fair. We negotiated like that most mornings. She had her mother's way of holding silence until the other person moved first. The drive to the Hallcourt Convention Center took 22 minutes. I arrived at 6:45, which gave me enough time to set up the 14th floor conference room before the mayor's communications team arrived to establish ownership over it. I had read the internal briefing memo someone had left on the projector table. I was not supposed to have read it, but when you are responsible for the room temperature and the AV system and the exact degree of screen tilt, that kind of context is useful. The memo described the session as the most consequential financial presentation of the fiscal year. I tested every microphone. I checked the slide file on both projectors. I confirmed screen alignment from 9 positions in the room. I moved the decoff to where the communications assistant pointed. Then I stood at the back and prepared to be useful in ways nobody would think to mention. Nadia had a small brass ruler clipped to her backpack, an architectural site ruler, the kind used for field drawings. It had been her mother's. Celeste carried it in her jacket pocket for 11 years. Nadia claimed it the week after the funeral and had not gone anywhere without it since. She said it helped her measure things. She was usually right about what needed measuring. Celeste was an urban planner. She reviewed development proposals for structural viability. She was careful and exact and had a gift for finding the one element in a project that everyone in the room had decided to stop looking at. She had been on a site inspection at a mixed-use construction project in the Western District when a temporary platform failed. The incident report cited a cost reduction decision made 18 months earlier. A contractor had substituted a cheaper anchoring system without recalculating load tolerances. They had been working from a financial model that prioritized return margins over compliance buffer. I had written that model, not their specific version, the base framework they adapted. A cost escalation methodology I published in 2013 as part of a municipal infrastructure study. It was picked up broadly, revised loosely, applied to projects it was not designed for. I updated it formally in 2021, 8 months before Celeste died, with a corrected material cost multiplier. The update changed conclusions significantly for large-scale construction. It was available. The contractor had used the old version. I left academic consulting 6 weeks after the funeral. No drama in it. I filed the paperwork, declined a leave of absence, and stopped answering speaking invitations and peer review requests. I found work I could finish by 5 in the afternoon. I had not missed a single school pickup in 4 years. Hallcourt's head of operations had asked, during the interview, whether I thought I was overqualified for a facilities role. I told him I wanted work where you could see the result at the end of a shift. He said that was a reasonable answer. He gave me the job. Victoria Calloway entered that conference room at 8:52 on a Tuesday in October, and every person already seated adjusted something about themselves. Postures straightened. 2 council members who had been disagreeing about a zoning ordinance suddenly found they agreed. Her assistant moved 3 steps ahead of her, pulling back the presenter's chair, repositioning a water glass 2 inches to the left, performing the small choreography of access that very wealthy people generate without appearing to notice. She was 38 years old. She had taken her father's struggling commercial real estate firm at 29 and spent the next 9 years building it into a development and urban technology company operating in 7 cities. The regional business publication had put her valuation at $2.1 billion. Their profile described her as driven and unsparing in her decisions. Both things appeared to be accurate. The project she was presenting was called Callaway Commons, a $3.8 billion mixed-income urban redevelopment of a 14-block corridor on the city's east side, structured as a public-private partnership. The city's pension fund would contribute $400 million in preferred infrastructure bonds. Her CFO, Thomas Avery, handled the financial section. He was 53, with the unhurried delivery of a man who had run this pitch enough times to know which numbers made the room lean forward. He pulled up the methodology slide. He named the base framework by title and author. The name on the slide was mine. The citation read, Webb, M.J., Infrastructure Investment Cost Modeling, a Municipal Framework. 2013, not the 2021 update. The original. The one with the cost escalation multiplier I had formally corrected 2 years before Celeste died. Applied to a project of this scale, that multiplier ran construction cost assumptions 34% below the current supply chain baseline. Not a small gap. On $3.8 billion of development, that gap didn't round off. It compounded across a 15-year return window. I stood at the back of the room and ran the calculation in my head. The shape of it was familiar. I had corrected this exact error hundreds of times in different forms. The projected return of 22% that Thomas Avery was presenting to the pension fund administrators was not 22%. With the corrected cost escalation applied, the city's $400 million investment would return a loss of roughly 8% over the same period. $400 million of retired city employees' money. I raised my hand. Nobody saw it. The room was focused on Victoria. I kept it raised. The journalist near the sidewall noticed me first. She looked toward the back, took in the badge and the clipboard, and returned her attention to the presenter. An investment advisor turned briefly, made some assessment, looked away. I was part of the room's furniture, functionally. Present the way equipment was present. I said, "Excuse me." The room turned. 31 people performed the same rapid, unconscious calculation about who had spoken. The result of the calculation was visible in how quickly most of them looked back at Victoria. She found me last. She looked at the badge, then the clipboard, then at the space between us with the expression of someone who has located the source of an interruption and is deciding how much of her attention it deserves. Thomas Avery said the Q&A period would follow the presentation. I said I understood that, and that what I needed to raise probably couldn't wait. Victoria said she was in the middle of a time-sensitive presentation for people who had cleared their full schedules for this morning. Her voice was even. She was not being cruel. She was being efficient in the way that people are efficient when they have already decided before you spoke what category of person you are. She said perhaps facilities concerns could be directed to the building coordinator after the session. I told her I was the building coordinator. She looked at me with the particular patience of someone waiting for a sentence to conclude. I said, "The model you're citing, the Webb framework, you're using the 2013 edition." She did not respond immediately. Nobody did. The kind of silence that lands in a room when someone has said something that the room doesn't yet know how to file. Thomas Avery recovered first. He said the citation had been verified by their research team against the published literature. I said the published literature included 2 versions, and that the 2021 revision existed specifically because the original contained a cost escalation multiplier that underperformed against current supply chain variables. The revision was peer-reviewed and formally indexed. It changed the outcome of the cost model in ways that were material to this project. Thomas said he was confident in the sourcing. I said I understood that, and that the confidence was the problem. A council member toward the middle of the table, a man named Drummond who I recognized from the building's quarterly maintenance walkthrough, asked me to clarify what I meant. Before I could, Victoria spoke. She said it was not standard procedure to take technical objections from support staff during a stakeholder presentation. She said she meant no disrespect. She used the phrase support staff the way some people use it, not as a designation, but as a boundary. The word support doing the work of explaining where I stood in relation to the room. Her chief of staff, a sharp woman named Priya who had been standing near the projection card, said she could escort me to a waiting area where someone from the team would take my notes. I thanked her. I stayed where I was. The room had a quality to it now that I recognized. I had been in rooms like it before, different furniture, different names on the door, but the same arrangement of people who had already agreed on the outcome and were working through the formality of agreeing again in front of each other. The objection from the back wall was an inconvenience. Inconveniences were managed, not heard. A pension fund administrator named Hartwell, who had been quiet for most of the presentation, asked Thomas whether there was a way to quickly verify the citation question. Thomas said the research team had done full diligence on the model and that they were happy to provide documentation after the session. Hartwell said he would appreciate that and marked something on his copy of the prospectus. Victoria looked at me for 2 full seconds with an expression I could not entirely read. Part of it was frustration. Part of it was something closer to assessment. Then she thanked me for my attention to detail, said again that someone would follow up, and asked Thomas to continue. I wrote 4 lines in my clipboard notes, sat down on the folding chair against the wall, and waited. The night before that meeting, I had been at the kitchen table past 11 with Nadia's science fair project half assembled in front of me. We were building a model of a suspension bridge. She had designed the load distribution herself, using the brass ruler and a protractor she had borrowed from school and not yet returned. She had gotten the tension angles right on the first attempt. I had told her so. She looked at the model for a few seconds and said she thought the secondary cables needed to be longer. She was correct. I asked her how she knew. She said the weight had to go somewhere and the short ones weren't going to reach. She was 9 years old and she had just described load path mechanics accurately without knowing the phrase. I wrote in my phone notes so I wouldn't forget it. The weight has to go somewhere, and the short ones weren't going to reach. I kept collecting things she said like that. I had a folder of them. We finished the bridge at 10:47. She was in bed by 11. I sat with the remaining balsa wood and the silence of the apartment and thought about nothing specific for a while. That was the closest I came to rest most nights. Not sleep, but the quiet after the work was done. I had not thought about the Calloway presentation. I had not been scheduled to manage that room. The original facilities coordinator had gone home sick at noon. His notes said the 14th floor needed AV setup and climate control, and a contact point for the lead presenter's arrival. Nothing in them mentioned what the presentation was. I had picked up the shift because I had no reason not to, and because staying busy was still better than the alternative. I had seen my name on the slide before Victoria walked in. I had read the citation and understood immediately what the room was about to do. I had considered saying nothing. I had considered it for about 3 minutes while I moved the decoff to where the assistant pointed. Then I thought about Hartwell's face, a careful man in a careful role, about to commit $400 million of other people's money to a conclusion built on a corrected error. I thought about the weight having to go somewhere. I raised my hand. The presentation wrapped up at 10:14. The council members gathered their folders. The investment advisors exchanged the low, satisfied murmur of people who have heard what they came to hear and are already mentally drafting the press release. Victoria moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which hands to shake and in which order. I stood and crossed the projection card and pulled up the Calloway Commons slide deck on the secondary monitor. I found a citation on slide 17. I opened the presentation document properties. I noted the source file metadata. I wrote the file creation date in my clipboard notes and underlined it twice. Priya appeared at my shoulder and asked, not unkindly, what I was doing. I told her I was verifying something. She asked if I could do it after the room cleared. I asked her if Hartwell had left yet. She looked toward the door. He hadn't. He was speaking with a council member near the credenza, still holding his copy of the prospectus. I walked over. I introduced myself. I told him I worked building facilities. I told him the citation on slide 17 referenced a 2013 framework and that the author of that framework had published a formal revision in 2021 that changed the cost escalation multiplier. I told him the revised multiplier, applied to the project figures they had been presented, produced a materially different return projection. I used the word materially the way I had been trained to use it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he asked what the corrected return would be. I told him. The blood moved out of his face in the particular way it moves when a number arrives that reframes every number you heard before it. He said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "How do you know this?" I said I wrote the framework. Priya had followed me across the room. She was close enough to hear. She stood very still. Hartwell asked my name. I told him. He looked at the badge, then at the clipboard, then at the expression of a man running a search behind his eyes and finding a result he did not expect. He said, Marcus Webb, the same Marcus Webb who wrote the municipal infrastructure model. I said yes. He said, quietly, as though he were confirming something to himself rather than asking me. And you've been working building maintenance. I said facilities coordination. Different thing. He almost smiled. Then he straightened and said he needed to speak with Victoria Calloway. Victoria was near the entrance with Thomas and two other members of her team. When Hartwell moved toward her, Priya intercepted me with the same, even courtesy she had used twice already. She said the situation needed to be managed carefully, and she asked me, one final time, to wait. I said I would wait in the room if that was acceptable. It was not the answer she was hoping for. Hartwell reached Victoria. He spoke. She listened with the practiced openness of someone who had learned to receive difficult information without showing the receiving of it on her face. Thomas leaned in. She held up one finger to pause him. She looked past Hartwell toward me. I had not moved from the position near the credenza. She said, "Come over here, please." When I reached them, she asked me to state, briefly and precisely, what I had told Hartwell. I said, "Your cost model uses my 2013 framework. That version has a supply chain escalation multiplier of 1.48. The 2021 revision corrects it to 2.13 based on updated material and labor indices across 11 regional markets. Applied to your total development budget at the 15-year horizon. The difference between those two multipliers changes your projected fund return from positive 22% to negative 8%. Approximately. The approximately was honest. I had done the math in my head across a 30-minute presentation. Thomas said that number was not possible given the contingency reserves built into the model. I said the contingency reserves had been calculated as a percentage of the original projected cost, which had itself been derived from the undervalued multiplier. They were a percentage of a low number. They did not absorb the full corrected gap. Thomas opened his mouth. Victoria put one hand up, and he closed it. A board member named Castellano, who had been drifting toward the door, came back. Someone near the projection cart pulled the model up on a laptop. A researcher I had not noticed before, a younger woman who had been sitting at the edge of the room through the whole presentation, started running figures. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the math is happening in real time and everyone present is waiting to see whether it confirms what they do not want confirmed. It took 6 minutes. The researcher looked up at Thomas first, then at Victoria. She said the revised multiplier checks out. Applied to the full cost model, the return differential is consistent with what he described. Nobody spoke. Victoria stood with her hands at her sides, and her weight evenly distributed, and her face doing the specific work of a person who has just watched something she built carefully come apart at a point she had not checked. She was not performing composure. She was finding it in real time because she needed it and because letting it go would not serve anyone in the room. She asked me one question. She said, "Why did you wait until the end of the presentation to say this?" I told her I raised my hand at slide 17. She told me to wait. I waited. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The room absorbed that. Hartwell had not moved. Castellano was back at the table. Two of the investment advisors had returned from the doorway. Thomas began to argue. He said independent research had reviewed the model. He said the firm had relied on publicly available literature. He said the 2021 update, while valid, was not universally adopted in practice, and that project teams regularly applied the original framework to long-horizon development. I said, the original framework was written with a sunset clause. Section 4, paragraph 3. It specified that the multiplier should not be applied to projects with a post-2020 material procurement window without adjustment. It was in the document he cited. Thomas said nothing. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "Who are you?" I said, "I coordinate facilities for this building. I set up this room this morning." She said, "That's not what I asked." A pause. The researcher was still looking at her laptop. Hartwell had his hands folded on the prospectus. Castellano was watching me. I said, "Marcus Webb. I wrote the model in 2013. I revised it in 2021 because the original was being applied in ways I hadn't designed for, and it was producing outcomes I couldn't stand behind. I've been doing this work for 4 years. The other kind before that for 11. I stopped because I had a reason to stop, and I had a daughter who needed me present. The framework didn't stop being mine because I changed jobs. The room was quiet long enough to mean something. Victoria's face moved through something I could not name precisely. It was not embarrassment, though some of that was in it. It was the expression of a person who has held a confident view of the world and has just discovered the view required a piece of information she had not had. She said, at normal volume, to no one in particular, "Pull the full 2021 document and get it to Thomas's team before noon." Then she looked at me and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "We're going to need to talk." She said it without theater. Just those 5 words, flat and direct, which was somehow harder to receive than anger would have been. I told her I needed to pick up my daughter at 3. She said we could talk before 3. The room began clearing around us. People left in clusters, some quiet, some already on their phones. Thomas gathered the prospectus copies from the table with the deliberate movements of a man performing calm he did not currently possess. Hartwell paused on his way out and told me, without elaborating, that he appreciated the clarity. Castellano shook my hand. Neither of them said anything to Victoria on the way past, which told its own story about what had shifted in the room's understanding of the morning. Priya stayed near the projection cart, tablet open, expression carefully neutral, which I suspected cost her something. Victoria asked for 20 minutes. I said yes. We sat at the far end of the conference table. She had her phone face down. I had my clipboard, which I set between us because I did not need it, but did not know where else to put it. She looked at it for a second, then at me. She asked how long I had been working in the building. I said 4 years. She asked what I had done before that. I told her the short version. Municipal infrastructure research, academic consulting, peer-reviewed publication, advisory work across 6 cities on financial modeling for large-scale development projects. I told her I left 11 years of that work in the span of about 3 weeks, right after my wife died. I did not explain the full connection. I said I had a daughter and that she needed a father who was present, and that present meant something specific. Victoria listened without speaking. She had a quality of attention that did not perform listening, but simply did it. She asked what my wife had done. I told her, urban planning, site verification, structural review. She asked if I was comfortable saying what happened. The summary: a construction platform failure, a load tolerance error, a contractor using the 2013 version of a cost model I wrote, substituting cheaper anchoring materials on a margin calculation that only worked if the multiplier was what the original said it was. Celeste had been on the site, verifying final structural compliance. She was doing her job well. The platform failed because someone else had not done theirs. Victoria was quiet. Then she said, "And you revised the model?" I said, 8 months later, yes. She looked at the badge on my jacket. She looked at the clipboard between us. She looked at the space those two things occupied together, all the distance between what I had been and what I appeared to be standing at the back of her presentation, and I could see her assembling something. Not guilt exactly, though it was nearby. The specific reckoning that arrives when you understand the shape of a mistake you made with full sincerity. That is in some ways harder to sit within a mistake made carelessly. She said, "I told you someone would follow up." I said yes. She said, "I meant it as a way to end the conversation." I said I knew that. She said nothing for a moment. Then, if Hartwell hadn't still been in the room, I said, someone else would have caught it eventually. Maybe. She heard the maybe. Victoria asked if she could ask me something personal. I said yes. She asked whether I missed the other work. I thought about Nadia at the kitchen table, running her thumb along the brass ruler before she spoke, the same way Celeste always had. I thought about the suspension bridge still drying on the counter at home. I thought about what it had cost to step back into rooms like this one, and what they had also given me on the specific mornings when I noticed something nobody else had looked at closely enough. I told her I missed certain parts. The precision. The way a well-built model told the truth about a project before the first dollar was spent. I did not miss the part where the model's conclusions were cited in presentations and then managed around when they produced inconvenient numbers. She received that without defending herself against it. She said, "You could have said nothing this morning." I said, "There were $400 million of pension money in that room. Retired teachers, sanitation workers, building inspectors. They spent careers earning that money." I wrote the original error. I wasn't going to let it compound because I was worried about the optics of where I was sitting when I found it. A long pause. A delivery cart moved through the corridor outside, wheels on marble, ordinary as anything. Victoria said she wanted to offer me something, and that she was not saying it to repair her dignity from the morning. The firm was now facing a significant revision to its entire financial modeling process for Calloway Commons, and the person best qualified to lead that revision was sitting across from her, wearing a facilities badge. She said, "I'd like to bring you in as a consulting analyst. Project scope only. Your terms." I told her I would think about it. She said she understood that might mean no. I said it meant I had a daughter to talk to first. She almost smiled. Not the professional kind. Something shorter and more honest. I asked her one question before leaving. Whether her team would reopen the full model or only the multiplier. She said, "What would you recommend?" I said, "A model built on an undervalued cost assumption tends to propagate that assumption through its contingency buffers, its phasing estimates, its risk adjustments. You want the full architecture, not just the number that surfaced today." She wrote something on the back of a folded page from the prospectus. She said, "That's about 6 weeks of work." I said, "Closer to 8, if you want it right." She said, "8 it is." I picked up my clipboard and left. The school pickup line on Tuesdays had its own particular character. Parents in cars, some on phones, some simply watching the entrance doors with the patient attention of people who have remembered that waiting for a child is not the same as wasting time. I parked in the same spot I always used, close to the crosswalk, close enough to see the doors when they opened. Nadia came out third. She handed me a folded piece of paper before she was fully in the car. It was a drawing of the suspension bridge. She had added a figure standing on it, labeled with my name in her best printing. The bridge was labeled load tested. I asked her what that meant. She said she had checked it and it held. I drove home without telling her what had happened that morning. We made dinner. We argued about whether rice counted as a vegetable. She said it grew from the ground, so it should count. I told her that was creative reasoning and put a second spoonful in her bowl. She ate it without comment, which was her version of winning. After she was asleep, I sat with the folded drawing and thought about Celeste, about the way good things built carefully hold up and the way failures almost always appear at the point nobody crouched down to examine. I called Victoria's office the next morning and spoke with Priya. 3 conditions. First, that my schedule accommodated school pickup without exception. Second, that I retained the right to escalate any modeling concern in writing with a required response window. Third, that the revised framework, when complete, will be published under both names. Mine and whoever on her team contributed substantially and not attributed to the firm's research division as proprietary methodology. Victoria called me herself at 11:40. She agreed to all 3. The 8 weeks that followed had their own rhythm. 3 mornings a week in Calloway's downtown office. I worked at a regular table in the open research area. I brought my own coffee. Thomas Avery spent the first week arguing with my methodology in the specific way people argue when they already know they are wrong and are buying time to accept it. By the 3rd week, he stopped arguing and started asking questions. By the 5th week, he was sending me sections of the model for review before they reached Victoria's desk. 3 additional errors surfaced in the full architecture. None were catastrophic on their own. Together, they had been steering the project toward a margin assumption that would have become a crisis around year 6 of the 15-year return window. The 3rd error was the one I stayed late for. A Phase 2 infrastructure cost that had been discounted against a federal subsidy the project had applied for but not yet received. Someone on the modeling team had booked the subsidy as confirmed income 18 months before the approval decision was due. It was the kind of optimism that looked like confidence until the denial letter arrived, and everything downstream of it had to be rebuilt. We corrected all of it. The revised projections were honest, and the revised projections were still viable, which was the thing Victoria had needed to know and had been building the wrong model to avoid finding out. The last 2 weeks carried a different weight. The work was nearly finished, but nobody was rushing it toward done. There was something deliberate in the pace, a collective willingness to take the extra day, run the extra check, which had not been present at the start. Thomas stopped using the phrase research team has verified and started saying, I want to walk through this again. It was a small change. It was the right one. She came to the research table on a Thursday afternoon near the end of the 6th week. She sat across from me without an agenda and asked how I was doing in a way that was not a formality. I said I was well. I asked about the hospital board presentation she had mentioned earlier in the week. She said it had gone differently than she planned, and that differently had turned out to mean better. I said that sometimes happened. She asked about Nadia. I told her about the suspension bridge, how it had held the weight of a textbook and a full water bottle and a small clay animal of uncertain species. She laughed at that, a real one, quick and unguarded. She said, I owe you more than a consulting fee. I said, you don't owe me anything you haven't already paid. She said, that's generous. I said, it's accurate. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said she had been asking building staff for their names when she arrived each morning. She had not done that before October. I did not comment on that. I thought it was the right thing to have heard quietly. I picked up Nadia at 3. She told me about a book her teacher had read, about a man who built a lighthouse and then had to live inside it for a winter alone. She said that sounded lonely. I said it probably was. She said the man kept the light on even when the storms were bad and no ships were expected. I asked why. She said because you never know who is looking for it. I drove the rest of the way home thinking about that for a long time. The brass ruler caught the afternoon light on her backpack. Small and plain and exactly itself, doing what it had always done, measuring what needed to be measured in the hands of someone willing to use it. Some tools are not valuable because of what they cost. They are valuable because of what the person holding them knows how to find and when to speak. That morning, in a room full of people with better chairs, I had held what I knew and waited for the right moment to say it. Nothing more than that. The room had done the rest. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.